Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm Joe Firestone, your host, and this is my third update of the day. This one is about dump the corruption. Those of you who watch me, hi, Kay. How are you? Thank you for being here. Uh, okay, those of you who watch me know, of course, that I'm very concerned about, or actually, I started a program last year called But Dump the Incumbents. Uh, okay, that show is about what I'm going to talk about tonight, but we changed the name to Dump the Corruption. And the reason for that is because it wasn't really just about dumping the incumbents, it was about dumping against or voting against all candidates who had been bought by big money. And what the whole purpose of dumping the corruption is, and dumping the incumbents was, the whole purpose was to get rid of the influence of big money in politics and to get rid of the toxicity that big money brings to the electoral process. So we have people who, recognizing that our democracy, okay, is in trouble, and that also our elections are corrupted, have suggested various solutions for making our democracy work better. For example, some people, when confronted with the facts that our elections are corrupted, say the solution is to get rid of the duopoly and vote for third parties. Never vote for a Democratic candidate. Never vote for a Republican candidate. Always vote for third parties. Then there are some other people who say, let's get ranked choice voting, because in a ranked choice voting type of situation, there will be space for independent candidates to run. If they run and come in second, and the first choice doesn't get 50% in a ranked choice race, there will be a runoff, and more third parties will be able to get into runoffs and will win runoffs if only we have ranked choice voting. That will weaken the duopoly, the supremacy of the two parties and the lock that they have, okay, on office. And then there will be more room for the voice of the people to get through. Uh, so that's another type of solution, okay, that's offered. There's vote for third parties. There is ranked choice voting. There are people who just advocate for getting rid of the duopoly entirely, somehow getting rid of the two major parties. Though, how are we to do that if we still have the money in the system, and if the two primary parties have the money in the system from the oligarchs. Then there's people who come up with some other solutions, like, for example, getting rid of the electoral college. And they point out that there are a number of people who were elected by a minority of the population who actually came in second in the popular vote. And these presidents have been very damaging to our political system because they did not really represent the popular will. So one thing that would do much to fix our system would be getting rid of the electoral college. So they offer that um, as a remedy. Okay, there are other remedies that are offered. For example, uh, many of us recognize that the problem with our politics is that there's too much money in it. The money buys candidates, and the candidates who are bought only vote for legislation, only enact new laws that are acceptable to the donors. And so we no longer live in a democracy, we live in an oligarchy. That's a lot of the argument of Bernie Sanders right now. And some people will then say, well, uh, we have a problem here because money has been made king. Money has been made king by the Supreme Court and by the Citizens United decision of 2010. So what we have to do, what's a solution, is to get rid of the CU decision. Well, how can we do that? Well, we can pass a constitutional amendment to do that, in theory. But how can we pass one if the people in both parties are bought by the big money? In other words, the influence of the big money has to be gotten rid of first if we're going to pass laws to get the money out of politics. And the same really goes for some of the other solutions that I've suggested here. How are we going to get ranked choice voting in most of the states if the people in Congress who are bought by the big money will not vote to get the ranked choice voting solution actually passed, except in a few, um, um, in a few states? How are we to get rid of the electoral college if the big money does not want us to, but to get rid of the electoral college? Uh, how are we going to get a Supreme Court majority into office that will vote to stop the influence of money, okay, in politics? In other words, the Supreme Court votes also, it votes on the cases, okay, it gets. There can be new suits that challenge the role of money in politics and that set up a situation for the Supreme Court to overturn its decision in the CU case. But how are we going to get a Supreme Court that will vote for that if we cannot pack the Supreme Court? And how can we pack the Supreme Court if the board Congress will not vote for packing the Supreme Court? So the various solutions we've talked about here are good solutions on paper, but they all require the collaboration of a Congress that has already been bought by big money. So what the issue comes down to is, do we, the people, have the power by ourselves to get rid of the big money in politics? And that, my friends, is what Dump the Corruption is about. That's what it's about. It's about people coming together to use a litmus test to vote against candidates that have taken big money or that are supported by big money through the super PACs that the big money creates. People can also be supported by big money by being supported by PACs that actually donate, to candidates. Or they can be supported by big money by taking big money directly from corporations, from party committees, or from wealthy people. So the litmus test applies to all of these situations. No matter how good a candidate sounds, no matter how attractive the candidate is, no matter the promises the candidate makes, when the candidate has taken big money or is supported by big money, that candidate cannot be trusted by the people. The people have to come together to vote against that particular candidate. So what is the task ahead of us now? It may be an easier task if the Democrats turn out to win in the midterms. Right now, on the eve of the midterms, it does not look like they are going to win. But win or lose, the transition to fascism will not be over with this election. It will continue to go on for at least a few more years. And during these years, we have the time to build a campaign where people come together to employ the litmus test of voting against candidates who either take big money or who are supported by big money, including their own big money. We can come together to develop a campaign where all the members of that campaign are dedicated to voting down the candidates that represent the big money. If we work that, if we try that, if we attempt that, if we chase that goal of building such a campaign, and we are successful, then we can eject the candidates of both parties that are taking the big money, and we can change the Congress over 3 election cycles so that there are no big money supported candidates in the Congress, so that they are all gone, every last one of them. That should be our goal. And that not only applies to the Congress, the litmus test campaign against toxic money, the toxic big money. That campaign can function at every level of politics so that the big money people are out of the state legislatures, so that the big money campaign are out of the city councils, so the big money people are out of governmental positions at all levels of our government. When we've done that, when we chase the big money out, then we can use the other solutions that we have thought of. We'll be able to pass those particular solutions. We'll be able to pass ranked choice voting. We'll be able to pass a constitutional amendment to get rid of big money in politics. We'll be able to pack the Supreme Court so that a new Supreme Court will overturn CU. Once we have representatives who will represent us, then if we want third parties, we'll be able to elect people from third parties because their messages won't be drowned out by others who have big money backing them. We'll be able to pass a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College, if we want to get rid of the Electoral College. We'll be able to pass laws to exclude big money from politics because the legislatures will no longer be bought. The Supreme Court is going to be, well, it's already working on critical cases. One particular case involving the independent state legislature doctrine. The ISLD, that doctrine puts forward the idea, advocates for the idea that the Constitution says that state legislatures have the final say about the elections that are conducted in the states. If that doctrine is accepted by the current Supreme Court, then our elections will no longer be democratic. It will be the end of democracy because the state legislatures will be making the decision about who won the presidential contests in their states, who won the contest for the Senate, who won the contest for the House, who won the contest for governor, who won all the elections, will be decided by the state legislatures, including deciding their own elections. It won't even matter what the state constitutions say. Just coming up this year, the Supreme Court will be taking a decision on the ISLD idea. If they decide that ISLD is constitutional overnight, that will turn us from being a democracy into being something we won't even recognize. We will be governed by one-party states all across the country. Our democracy will be entirely undermined. Many of these one-party states will be states that in perpetuity will be Trumpist. We have a situation coming up after the election where what I've just described is a possibility. This Supreme Court will be in position to rule positively on the ISLD. We cannot allow that. We need to have a majority of people in Congress that will not allow that. We will have to work hard against that. I will say more. I will go further. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of the ISLD, then it will be up to the executive branch and it will be up to Congress to say, we don't accept that constitutional interpretation. We're sorry, we have sworn an oath to the Constitution, just as sacred as the oath that you justices have sworn. We are sworn to protect and defend the Constitution, and we don't think the Constitution says what you think the Constitution says. We don't even think that the Constitution supports or has said that there shall be judicial supremacy. We think there's nothing in the Constitution that says that. So we think we, the members of the other branch that have also sworn oaths to the Constitution, believe that you need our consent to make something law. That all three branches have to consent to an interpretation of the law that you give, because the Constitution doesn't provide for judicial supremacy. So we do not recognize, we will not recognize the ISLD, even if you consider it to be constitutional. If the ISLD is supported by you, our response will be, that's what you decided. Now let the Supreme Court enforce it. That will be what we will have to do. Anyway, going back to the main point. The struggle The struggle for democracy will not end if the Republicans win in 2022. There will be another election coming up in 2024. And by the time that election comes around, we have to have the dump the corruption movement in full flower. We will have to have a movement that is so powerful, that the heavy majority of people will vote against the candidates that have taken the big money and will vote for candidates that do not take any of the big money, either in primaries or in the general election. We have to have a majority voting for candidates that do not take any of the big money, that have voted against candidates that do take the big money. That's the only way we'll be able to dump the corruption. If we had that movement now, the Republicans would not be winning tomorrow. Neither would most of the Democrats. Only the Democrats that haven't taken big money will win. And by the way, they won't be a majority. What would happen in such an election, and what could happen in 2024, is that every single one of the Republicans would probably be defeated, and a heavy majority of Democrats would probably be defeated. So you want to vote for third parties, folks? Some of you want to vote for the Green Party, folks? Green Party people won't have taken any big money, because the big money won't even be offered to them. Other small parties won't be getting any of the big money, so their candidates are going to win too. We could change the political system in 3 election cycles if we empower this movement. The most important thing we could do to empower democracy would be to empower this dump the corruption movement. Please join me in pushing this movement to the fore. It is among our main concerns in this Empowering Democracy series. One of our main concerns. Okay, let me open up the floor now. Ranked choice voting needs to be nationwide. I agree, Kay. The way to get that is to support the dump the corruption movement. Steve says, I might have to picket with the strippers in North Hollywood. Steve, that would be fun. Wesley Weil says, Joe, have you heard Chomsky's critique of James Madison and the Constitution? His intention to prevent democratic participation from influencing a wealthy aristocrat class. I haven't heard Chomsky's specific critique, but of course, I'm aware of what Madison was trying to do, since I've been studying, maybe I haven't been studying the Constitution quite as long as Chomsky, because I'm not quite as old as Chomsky. But I am 83, and I have been studying the Constitution for many, many, many years. Okay, and I know that Madison's intention was to prevent the Democratic participation from influencing a wealthy aristocrat class, because I know that Madison was no Democrat. There was a world, there's a world of difference between James Madison and Thomas Paine. A world of difference between the two men. And the Constitution of James Madison was much more similar to the Constitution of Alexander Hamilton. After all, they compromised on that Constitution than it was to the kind of Constitution that would have been written by Thomas Paine, the real Democrat that was spawned by the American Revolution. So, I haven't heard Chomsky's critique, but there are many critiques of the Constitution from a democratic standpoint. It is not a democratic, but small d document. And I'm very much for changing key parts of it. But before we should try to change key parts of it, we have to dump the corruption in the Congress. That's the key step. We have to get rid of money out of politics. What I've been trying to show you here is that we, the people, have the power to chase the toxic money out of politics. And that if we do that, we can change all manner of things, including the Constitution. Steve says he might make some new friends in the process. You might. Kay says, yes, you will. Kay says, I share you on Facebook, Joe. Thank you, Kay. I really appreciate that. Wesley Wiles says, Chomsky has a good critique on it. I'll send you the link on Twitter. Thank you, Wesley. I appreciate that. But Madison called that group, quote, masters of mankind, unquote. Chomsky basically says the Declaration of Independence calls for democracy, and Madison kills that call by railroading his ideas into the Constitution. Yes, I agree with that. I agree that that is what happened. The Constitution was a reaction. It was a reaction against the Declaration of Independence and much of the thought in there. And it was a reaction that did much to protect the rich and the slaveholders. It was a compromise that the slaveholders could accept. Kay says, money out of politics. Yes, Joe. Money out of politics. Okay, if there are no more comments, then I think what I may do is to do what I didn't have time to do, okay, in the session before this one, in the stream before this one. I wanted to call your attention to an article that concerned states' rights about to come back. is what the article is called. It calls attention to a couple of pending cases on immigration and child welfare that could dramatically swing the balance of power away from the president and the Congress and bring the balance of power back to the states. I will show that one here. I picked it up at Portside. The article was by Kimberly Welly, I guess, or maybe Whaley. It was a Politico article on November 2nd, 2022. It calls attention to the fact that the Dobbs decision was groundbreaking, not because it revamped the 14th Amendment's protection of abortion rights, or not just because of that, but that it also configured the relationship between the Constitution and the states, giving the latter primary authority over pregnancies, well, really over the fate of women. In this new term of the court, 2 less notice cases may well continue the march toward enhancing state power at the expense of the federal government. So are you ready for that? In a worst case scenario, decisions in favor of the states would open the door to a slew of legal challenges to any federal policy that a state might object to, effectively neutering the president's constitutional authority to enforce laws passed by the legislative branch. The first case is United States versus Texas and Louisiana. Concerns a set of administrative guidelines the Biden administration's Department of Homeland Security issued in September of 2021 for deciding which immigrants should be arrested and deported on grounds of, quote, national security, public safety, and border security, unquote. There are 11 million undocumented non-citizens in the country. I challenge that particular number because, at least for the last 10 years, people have been saying there are 11 million undocumented non-citizens in the country. I don't know how people know that. I mean, I admit at the time there might have been some counting going on, and that might have been reasonable for 2009 and 2010. But I don't think that the census has been successful in counting how many undocumented non-citizens there are. There could be less than that, a lot less, because people might have gone back to Mexico. And there might be a lot more than that. I just don't know. And limited government resources to apprehend and remove every one of them. Accordingly, the guidelines gave Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents, ICE, broad discretion to decide whether to arrest someone using criteria that include the seriousness of an individual's past offense, the harm caused, whether a firearm was involved, the individual's youth or advanced age, and the impact of deportation on their family. In 2021, Texas and Louisiana filed suit to block the guidelines. A federal district judge in Texas entered an injunction banning use of the guidelines nationwide, which an appeals court upheld. In June, the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, refused to lift the stay even temporarily. The case is a breathtaking swipe at the authority of presidents to execute federal law on immigration. The president, through his appointed Secretary of Homeland Security, effectively picks and chooses how best to enforce the Immigration and Nationality Act. while Trump set out to arrest and speed deportations of any non-citizen in the country without authorization, President Joe Biden and his DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas chose a less draconian approach that is more closely aligned with that of Barack Obama's. The states argued that Congress mandated detentions across the board in the INA, and the federal government disagrees. But what's stunning about the case isn't the debate over the contents of the guidelines. It's the fact that the states, not an individual who is susceptible of deportation, are the plaintiffs here, and so far they've been successful. If this were another court, this case would already have been thrown out, saying that the states do not have standing to sue. Understandably, the federal government argues the states have no business suing the Biden administration to force it to execute federal law in ways that please the states, as they lack standing to sue under Article 3 of the Constitution. Okay, this is what the article says. The only injury the states allege is that more non-citizens within their borders increase the costs of law enforcement and social services. In a nod to Dobbs, the federal government responds that federal policies always impact states, and there's nothing special about this case. Federal policies routinely have incidental effects on states' expenditures, revenues, and other activities, yet such effects have never been viewed as judicially cognizable injuries. As the recent explosion in state suits vividly illustrates, respondents' contrary view would allow any state to sue the federal government about virtually any policy, sharply undermining Article 3's requirements and the separation of powers principles they serve. Here, the states are neither subject to nor threatened with enforcement of the immigration laws. They may not challenge the federal government's policies regarding the enforcement of these laws against third parties. If the court decides the standing issue in the state's favor, it would be an open invitation for states to go into federal court to usurp presidential discretion to enforce not just immigration policy, but any exercise of presidential power that has a financial impact on a state. Anyway, that is a ridiculous case. In the second case, the Brackeen versus Haaland case, Haaland, of course, is Deb Haaland, who is our Secretary of the Interior at this point. Anyway, that state was brought by Texas jointly with a married couple against the Biden administration. But this time, the potential loser in the state versus federal government power struggle would be Congress. Its implications for the respective powers of government are equally staggering. Texas aims to strike it down as unconstitutional, a 43-year-old federal statute known as the Indian Child Welfare Act. In the mid-20th century alone, nearly one-third of Native children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in foster care with adoptive families or in boarding schools by the federal government. Congress passed the ICWA in a remedial effort to keep Indian children in Native families to the extent possible, thereby promoting tribal integrity and stability. The statute accordingly sets up standards for child welfare proceedings that favor placement of Native children with other family members, members of the parent's tribal nation or another Native family. A dispute arose when the Brackeen family, a white evangelical couple who fostered and successfully adopted a Navajo child under the ICWA, sought to adopt another child, a younger sister, but were allegedly hindered by the ICWA. Together with Texas, the Brackeen sued the federal government, arguing the statute is an unconstitutional impediment to their families' plans because it makes racial distinctions by categorizing children based on genetics and ancestry and potential adoptive parents based on their race in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Well, I'm not going to go through how the federal government responds because my time is limited. But the ruling could lead to a slew of laws being struck down. Things including tribal land and water rights and tribal sovereignty broadly. It could also have future implications for Congress's broader powers under the Commerce Clause, which is a basis for wide swaths of federal law, including the ICWA. Okay, there's more in this case which I'm not going to go into, but you can see that what can be done by the right-wing majority in the Supreme Court could be what the author calls the jaw-dropper news of this Supreme Court term. Yes, it could be. These things could greatly cut into the powers of the federal government. It could pretty much have the effect of, over time, the states simply dissolving most of the authority of the federal government. I mean, these cases are ridiculous. And it's ridiculous that the Supreme Court has not already decided, ruled against the plaintiffs simply based on the idea that they have no standing. So, I did want to mention that case because I want to get back to the idea that we have to stop this Supreme Court. It is in various ways beginning to unwind the authority of the federal government and the idea that we are one nation under law. This Supreme Court, in my view, is a lawless Supreme Court whose interpretations of the Constitution are utterly unfounded. We must have a movement that will elect people in the Congress who are willing to pack the court to overturn some of its very extreme decisions, and who are also willing to impeach those Supreme Court justices that obviously lied in their confirmation hearings. There was another article this morning that appeared that talked about some discoveries that came from reading from the release of Teddy Kennedy's diaries. There's an account, in one of his diaries where he talks about how Sam Alito said very directly that he respected precedents and that Roe v. Wade was settled law. And that he had no argument with it as a settled law. he basically told Kennedy he wasn't going to do anything about it. What he told Kennedy was in line with his confirmation testimony, but totally at variance with his decision in Jackson versus Dobbs. So there are a lot of reasons why we have to dump the corruption and why we have to have this huge campaign that by 2024 is capable of replacing the House completely with people who don't take any big money, and which is capable of replacing 1/3 of the Senate with people who don't take any big money. We absolutely need that to do so many things that are vital for our existence as a people. Let me go back to your comments here. I'll pick it up where CC Swift comes in. Says, hey, Joe, off topic, but you're so stinking smart. Were the Pilgrims communist? Did Bradford proclaim communism a failure? Thanks. Okay. I need insight for a school. Well, okay, my comment on this would be, I don't remember enough about the Pilgrims to say whether they were communist in some interpretation of that particular term. But I think it is clear that if there were communists, they were far different from the Marxist communists. And if they were socialists, they were more akin to the utopian socialists than they were to the Marxist socialists. So I hope that helps for school. Kay asks CC Swift, are you a teacher or a student? CC Swift says a student. Kay says good for you. Kay says I should have went to college back when it was cheap. Yeah, in some of the states, there was no tuition to go to college. I mean, you could just go. If I recall correctly, that was true in the California system. For a long time, it was true in the city of New York system that you could go to any of the colleges of the city of New York, and it was free. C.C. Swift points to an article that the DOJ, Department of Justice, will not be allowed. Department of Justice federal officials are running into resistance in Missouri over election monitoring. Jason Hancock of the Missouri Independent. So it starts, that already lets you know that they're planning on cheating, stealing. Yeah, I suspect so. Sure, they're planning on cheating, stealing. I think the Trumpists all across the country are planning on cheating and stealing. And C.C. Swift said, yes, thank you. I didn't know how to compare. You rock. Well, thank you, C.C. I certainly appreciated that. Okay, folks, it's about 9:55 now, and I try to keep these third streams to about an hour. So, unless there's a comment or two more, I will say good night for tonight. And I will see you again tomorrow. Most probably, I'll be talking about the elections during the day tomorrow. And I'll probably also be talking about uh, the results as far as we know them tomorrow night. But there might be some other important things that I want to talk about as well. Kay says, "Night, Joe, and all. I love you all. And we love you too, Kay. Thank you very much for coming and for sharing and for supporting the show. And thank you, Dolores, if you're still here. As well, thank you all for coming. I'll see you tomorrow."